The moment the scullery girl spoke, 7 lords turned to stare, their laughter catching in their throats like dry leaves. She was a creature of ash and soot, of cold water and chapped hands, a ghost who haunted the edges of their gilded world. He was Lord Calin, the shadow of the north, master of a fortress carved from a mountain's heart. A king whose name was a winter storm whispered for 500 years they should not have been in the same room, let alone the same breath. She was meant to be invisible, and he was a man who saw everything. But what no one in that hall understood, what the 7 laughing lords could never comprehend, was that for the first time in centuries, he was not looking at a servant. He was looking at a key. If you believe that being truly seen by one person can change the world, type "witness" below, and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you must know that Della was a memory keeper. Not by trade, of course. By trade, she was nothing. Less than nothing. A scullery maid at Blackwood Manor, the sprawling, damp estate of the boorish Lord Malvern. Her hands were raw from lye soap, and her knees ached from stone floors. She was a fixture, a piece of worn furniture that the household staff and their betters looked through, not at. But before this life of grey drudgery, there had been another, a life of books and soft light, as a paid companion to a lady of gentle birth. In that life, Della had discovered her gift. She could read a page once and hold it in her mind forever. A line of poetry, a complex recipe, a page of dry history, it all imprinted itself behind her eyes, perfect and permanent. That life had ended in disgrace. A pearl necklace had gone missing, and a convenient accusation had fallen upon the quiet, bookish companion. Della was dismissed without a reference, her name blackened with a crime she did not commit. The whispers followed her down, from the drawing room to the carriage house, and finally into the cavernous, steaming kitchens of Lord Malvern's estate, the only place that would have her. Here no one cared about her past, because no one cared about her at all. Her gift, however, remained. She fed it with scraps, a discarded newspaper used to wrap fish, a page torn from a ledger to light a fire, the spine of a book glimpsed through a half-open library door. She collected these fragments in the silent library of her mind, a treasure no one could see or steal. On this particular night, the great hall of the manor was ablaze with light. Lord Malvern was hosting a delegation of neighboring lords, 7 of them, all powerful, arrogant men who smelled of wine and horses, and with them, at the head of the great oak table, sat the one man even they feared. Lord Calin. He was not from their sunlit world of hunts and harvests. His domain was the jagged, pine-choked mountains to the north, a place of long shadows and older secrets. He was ancient, they whispered, unnaturally still, with eyes that held the depth of a frozen lake at midnight. Tonight, they were a startling, impossible crimson, catching the candlelight like chips of ruby. A strange chill seemed to emanate from his end of the table, a pocket of winter in the sweltering, fire-lit hall. Della was on her knees in the shadows along the wall, polishing the silver. It was her duty to remain unnoticed, to make the family crest on each goblet and plate gleam without a single sound. Her world was the scent of beeswax and metal polish, the dull ache in her back, and the murmur of powerful voices she was meant to ignore. But she could not ignore the words. They were discussing the crumbling peace, the fraying edges of a treaty signed generations ago. "The pact is worthless without the full text," grumbled Lord Vance, a man with a face like a clenched fist. The binding clauses, the rights of renewal, they were in the appendices, lost to the fire at Oakhaven. We have fragments, another countered, pushing a piece of worn parchment across the table. This mentions the Sunstone affirmation, but what is it? How is it performed? Lord Malvern, eager to appear knowledgeable, leaned forward. My father always said it involved a pledge made at high noon, a solar rite. It stands to reason. Della's hands stilled on a silver ewer. The steward, a careless man, had used several pages of a very old, crumbling document as scrap. He'd scribbled lists of wine casks on the back. Della had been the one to clear them away, to use them to light the morning fires in the kitchens. But not before she had read them. Her heart began to beat a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. The words they were searching for were branded in her memory. She saw the elegant, archaic script behind her eyes. The affirmation is not of the sun, but of the scion. The stone must be presented under the gaze of the full moon, its light a mirror to the soul's pledge. To speak was unthinkable. It was madness. It was an invitation to ruin, to be whipped and thrown out into the night. A scullery maid did not correct a lord, but the words were wrong. Their ignorance was a dissonant chord in the perfect music of the text she held in her mind. It was an insult to the truth of it. Before she could stop herself, a small, quiet voice slipped from her lips, barely a whisper, yet it cut through the din shun of the hall like a shard of glass. No, my lord, it is a lunar rite. Silence. A thick, absolute silence fell over the great hall. The 7 lords turned as one, their faces a mixture of confusion and outrage. Lord Malvern's face purpled with fury. Who had dared? Their eyes searched the room and finally landed on the small, kneeling figure in the shadows, a polishing cloth clutched in her hand like a shield. Della felt the weight of their collective gaze like a physical blow. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the very stone of the floor. Then Lord Vance let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. The other lords joined in, a wave of cruel, booming laughter that washed over her, drowning her in shame. A scullery maid, a piece of kitchen filth, daring to speak. What was that, girl? Lord Malvern snarled, rising from his chair. You will be flogged for this insolence. But his threat died in his throat, because a voice low and cold as the grave sliced through the laughter and stopped it dead. Let her speak. It was Lord Kalin. He had not moved, not a muscle. He sat at the head of the table like a carved monument, his chin resting on one steepled hand. But his eyes, his crimson eyes, were fixed on Della. There was no anger in them. There was only an unnerving, predatory focus, an absolute, terrifying attention. The chill in the room deepened. The candle flames nearest him seemed to shrink, to gutter as if in a sudden wind, though the air was perfectly still. His shadow, cast long and sharp behind him, seemed to writhe, to pool and darken in a way that defied the light. I asked a question, he said, his voice quiet, yet it carried the weight of utter command. What did you say? Della's throat was dry as dust. She swallowed, her gaze locked with his. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, the world falling away behind her. There was no going back. She rose slowly to her feet, her borrowed gown, worn and faded, seeming to shrink on her frame. But she lifted her chin. I said, my lord, that the Sunstone affirmation is a lunar rite. It must be performed under the full moon. Lord Vance scoffed. And how would a creature like you know such a thing? I read it, she said simply. The laughter threatened to start again, but Lord Kalin raised a single finger, and the room fell silent once more. He did not look at the other lords. His gaze never left Della. "Show me," he commanded. Not a request. An order that resonated in the very bones of the hall. I cannot, my lord," she stammered. "The pages were used by the steward for lists. They were burned this morning." Lord Malvern saw his chance to reassert his authority. "You see, the girl is a liar and a madwoman. She will be punished at once." "She will not," Kalin interrupted, his voice dropping even lower, taking on a dangerous edge. "She will be brought to this table." A collective gasp went through the room. The lords stared, mouths agape. A servant? At the high table? The insult was profound. The breach of protocol unthinkable. Lord Vance, emboldened by wine and his own self-importance, chuckled again. "My lord, surely you jest. The girl smells of soap and cinders. She has no place here." 7 lords, puffed up with their own status, joined his derisive laughter. The reaction was not loud. It was silent, and far more terrifying. The temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began to spiderweb across the window panes. The candles on the table flickered violently and then extinguished all at once, plunging the hall into a twilight lit only by the great hearth. Lord Kalin's shadow detached itself from the wall, a solid thing of living darkness that flowed across the floor like spilled ink, coiling at the feet of the laughing lords, who now sat frozen in their chairs, their faces pale with a sudden primal fear. Kalin rose from his seat. He did not seem to walk so much as glide through the chilled air, a predator moving through its own element. He stopped beside Della. "A place is not given," he said, his voice a murmur meant only for her, yet it echoed in the terrified silence. "It is made." He extended a hand. It was a gentleman's gesture, but it felt like the sealing of a fate. His skin was impossibly cool. Hesitantly, she placed her chapped, work-worn hand in his. His grip was firm, possessive. He led her from the shadows and towards the head of the table, to the empty chair beside his own. As they walked, the lords shrank back from them. He pulled the heavy oak chair out for her, an act of courtesy so profound in its context. It was an act of war. Della sank into it, the carved wood cold against her back. She was now seated among them, a wren in a convocation of eagles. Lord Kalin remained standing, his hand resting on the back of her chair, a clear gesture of protection, of ownership. He looked down the long table at the 7 pale, silent men. "She will speak," he said, his crimson eyes sweeping over them. "And you will listen." He then turned his gaze to a trembling servant. "Bring her wine and food, the best you have." The servant scurried to obey. A plate of roasted quail and a silver goblet of deep red wine were placed before Della. The lords watched, their faces masks of disbelief and fury. The vampire king had not only seated the scullery maid at his table, he had ordered her served first. Della looked down at the fine food, her stomach churning with a fear so potent it felt like illness. She could not eat. She could barely breathe. Kalin seemed to sense her turmoil. He leaned down, his voice a low vibration near her ear. "Tell me what you remember. Every word." And so, she did. She closed her eyes, shutting out the hostile faces, the opulent hall, the impossible situation. She retreated to the quiet library of her mind, to the image of the crinkled parchment with the steward's shopping list on the back. The elegant, archaic script bloomed in the darkness. She began to speak. Her voice, at first a trembling whisper, grew stronger, clearer, as the words flowed from her memory. She recited the lost appendices of the treaty. She spoke of the lunar rite, the specific incantations, the required astronomical alignments, the history of the sunstone itself. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes, the intricate, forgotten text spilling from her lips, flawless and complete. When she finished, the hall was utterly still. The only sound was the crackle of the fire in the hearth. She opened her eyes. The lords were staring at her, their arrogance replaced by a stunned, grudging awe. They had been searching for this text for years, and she had held it all in her head, a secret treasure gleaned from the trash. Lord Kalin looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than cold authority in his crimson eyes. It was a flicker of something. Vindication? No, it was more than that. It was the look of a man who had been searching for a very specific, very rare key and had just found it in the most unlikely of places. He straightened up, his hand still resting on her chair. His gaze swept the table once more. "Her work here is finished," he announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. "My work with her is just beginning. She will accompany me back to my lands. Tonight." Lord Malvern finally found his voice, sputtering with indignation. "She is my servant. You have no right." Kalin turned his head slowly to look at Malvern. The shadows in the room deepened again, clinging to Kalin's form like a cloak. "Right?" he repeated, the word a soft, dangerous hiss. "I am Lord Kalin. I have every right. She is no longer your servant. She is now under my protection. Do you wish to challenge that?" The threat was unspoken, but absolute. Lord Malvern shrank in his chair, his face ashen. He shook his head, a tiny, jerky movement. Kalin's attention returned to Della. "Go and gather what you own," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "You will have little. It does not matter. You will be provided for." Della could only nod, her mind reeling. She was being taken, rescued, abducted. She didn't know. All she knew was that her life as an invisible scullery maid was over, ended by the will of the ancient, terrifying man beside her. She was escorted from the hall by two of Kalin's personal guards, silent men cloaked in black. As she left, she could feel the burning hatred of the seven lords and the impotent fury of Lord Malvern on her back. Her belongings fit into a small cloth bundle. A change of worn clothes, a small wooden bird her father had carved for her, and nothing else. Within the hour, she was being handed into a carriage that was as black as a starless night, the horses stamping and snorting clouds of steam into the cold air. Lord Kalin was already inside, waiting for her. The interior was lined with dark velvet, surprisingly comfortable. The door shut with a heavy, final thud, sealing them inside. With a lurch, the carriage began to move, carrying her away from Blackwood Manor and into an unknown future. They rode in silence for a long time, the only sound, the rhythmic drumming of hooves on the road. Della sat opposite him, clutching her small bundle, too afraid to speak. The chill that always seemed to surround him was more pronounced in the enclosed space. It was a deep, profound cold, the cold of stone and winter nights. Finally, he spoke, his voice pulling her from her trance. "You are afraid." It was a statement, not a question. "Yes, my lord," she whispered, You have no reason to be, he said. No harm will come to you in my care. You have my word. Why? She asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. Why me? He regarded her for a long moment, his crimson eyes seeming to glow in the darkness of the carriage. Because you see what others do not, and you remember what others forget. That is a rare and valuable talent. The carriage ride lasted through the night. As dawn threatened to break, they arrived at his fortress, a grim, imposing citadel of black stone that seemed to claw at the sky. It was a place of towers and battlements, softened only by the ancient pines that crowded its base. She was led not to a servant's cell, but to a suite of rooms high in a tower. They were Spartan but clean, with a roaring fire, a soft bed, and a window that looked out over a dizzying expanse of mountains and mist. There were even books on a shelf: poetry, history, astronomy. It was more luxury than she had ever known. For 2 days, she was left alone, tended to by a silent elderly housekeeper who brought her meals and fresh clothes. Della began to wonder if it had all been a strange dream. On the evening of the 3rd day, Lord Kalin summoned her. He was waiting for her in a vast, circular library. Bookshelves soared from the floor to the domed ceiling, filled with thousands of volumes. In the center of the room was a massive wooden table, covered not with a treaty, but with dozens of charred, brittle fragments of parchment. They were far too delicate to be the remnants of the pact she had recited. This was something else entirely. The treaty was a test, Kalin said, without preamble. He gestured to the scorched pieces on the table. This is the true work. Della approached the table cautiously. The script on the fragments was the same archaic style as the treaty, but the words were different. They spoke of wards and bindings, of shadows and containment, of a ritual to be performed at the heart of the fortress. My ancestor, the first to claim this land, did not build this citadel merely as a home, Kalin explained, his voice low and grave. He built it as a prison. There is a presence here, an entity of shadow and hunger, bound to the foundations of this keep. It is ancient, malevolent, and strong. He paused, his crimson eyes fixed on the charred remains. A ritual of binding holds it in check. It must be renewed every 100 years, on the night of the winter solstice. The last copy of that ritual was destroyed in a fire 50 years ago. The next solstice is in 3 weeks. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in Della's mind. The cold that clung to him, the shadows that seemed to obey him, the immense, weary weight she saw in his eyes. He wasn't just a lord, he was a jailer, a warden of some unspeakable thing. The fragments you see here are all that remain, he continued. I have spent decades trying to piece them together, but my memory of the full text is imperfect. I need someone who can see the patterns, who can hold the pieces in their mind and reconstruct the whole from the parts. I need you, Della. He looked at her then, and the mask of the cold, unassailable lord fell away for just a moment. She saw a glimpse of the man beneath, a man burdened by a terrible, centuries-long duty. The loneliness in his gaze was a chasm. This is why you brought me here, she said softly. It was not an accusation. It is, he confirmed. I offer you a choice. Help me, and when this is done, you will have a new life. Wealth, a title, a place of respect anywhere you choose to go. Your name will be cleared, and the men who scorned you will answer for it. Or refuse, and I will have you returned to Lord Malvern's estate, unharmed. You will be a scullery maid once more, and I will face the solstice alone." She looked from his face to the broken text on the table. She thought of the life of shame and invisibility that awaited her if she refused. Then she thought of him, standing against a nameless horror for centuries, alone. She had been dismissed and forgotten by the world. But here, this powerful, ancient being was asking for her help. He saw her. He saw her value. And in that moment, she felt not fear, but a strange, unexpected surge of compassion. "I will help you," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Not for a reward, but because it is the right thing to do." For the second time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, and something that might have been gratitude. He gave a slow, solemn nod. "Then we begin. Would you have stayed, knowing the darkness he was trying to contain? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family." Their days fell into a quiet, intense rhythm. The library became their world. They worked from dawn until long after the moon had risen, surrounded by the scent of old paper, leather, and beeswax. Della's mind, starved for so long, came alive. She handled the fragile, charred fragments with a surgeon's care, her memory piecing together sentences from single words, paragraphs from broken phrases. She saw the ghost of the full text taking shape, a complex tapestry of celestial alignments, ancient words of power, and intricate ritual actions. Kalen worked beside her, his stillness a counterpoint to her focused energy. He was a creature of immense patience. He would watch her for hours, his crimson eyes tracking her every movement as she arranged the fragments on a swath of black velvet. He answered her questions about the archaic language, his knowledge of forgotten history seemingly endless. He was not a cruel master. In fact, he was not a master at all. He treated her as a colleague, a scholar. He would bring trays of food to the library himself, simple meals of bread, cheese, and dark wine, insisting she eat, insisting she rest. One evening, as rain lashed against the high, arched windows, he found her shivering, a thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The library, for all its grandeur, was drafty. Without a word, he left, and returned a few moments later with a heavy cloak of dark gray wool, lined with fur. It was impossibly soft and carried the faint, clean scent of pine smoke and cold night air. He draped it over her shoulders himself, his cool fingers brushing the nape of her neck. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, a strange mixture of the chill from his skin and a surprising warmth that bloomed in her chest. "Thank you, my lord," she whispered, pulling the cloak tighter. "Kalen," he said, his voice quiet. "My name is Kalen." It was a small offering, but it felt momentous, a bridge being built across the chasm of station and nature that separated them. "Della," she replied, though she knew he already knew her name. Their conversations began to drift from the ritual text. He would ask her about the books she had read in her former life, and he would listen, truly listen, as she spoke of them. In return, she began to ask him about the past, not of battles or politics, but of small things. What did the stars look like 500 years ago? What was it like to see a forest that had never known an axe? He would answer, his voice a low, melancholic murmur, painting pictures of a world long vanished. He spoke of cities that were now dust, of kings whose names were forgotten, of constellations that had since shifted in the sky. Through his stories, she began to grasp the true scale of his existence, the crushing weight of the years, the profound loneliness of being the last witness to so much that was gone. The shadows in the keep remained a constant presence. They pooled in the corners of the library, stretched and swayed in the firelight. At first, Della had been unnerved by them, but she came to realize they were an extension of him. When she grew tired and her head drooped over the texts, a shadow would lengthen from the corner and seem to cover her like a gentle blanket. When a stack of books threatened to topple, a sliver of darkness would dart out and steady it. They were his sentinels, his companions, and they had accepted her into their silent world. One night, she found him not in the library, but in a high, cold observatory she hadn't known existed. A massive brass telescope pointed out of an open dome at the star-dusted sky. He was not looking through it. He was simply standing there, staring up at the vast, cold emptiness, his profile stark against the night. "It is beautiful," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "It is a graveyard," he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "Most of the stars you see are already dead. Their light is just now reaching us. We are looking at ghosts." The melancholy in his words was so profound it ached in her own chest. She looked from the sky to his face. "But their light still travels," she said. "It still reaches us. It still makes the night less dark. That is not nothing." He turned his head to look at hers, and the raw, ancient loneliness in his eyes was staggering. It was the gaze of a man who had been alone in the dark for so long he had forgotten the possibility of light. "Your voice," he said, the words barely a whisper. "It is the first warmth I have felt in a century." He reached out, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he were afraid she might bolt. He gently brushed a stray curl of hair from her cheek. His touch was as cold as marble, yet a fire bloomed on her skin where his fingers had been. It was the most intimate gesture she had ever known. Her breath caught in her throat. She did not pull away. She leaned into the touch, just for a second, a silent affirmation. He let his hand fall, but his eyes never left hers. In that shared gaze under the light of dead stars, something shifted between them. The scholar and her patron, the warden and his key, those roles dissolved, leaving only a man and a woman, standing together against an overwhelming darkness. As the solstice drew nearer, the atmosphere in the keep grew heavier, more oppressive. The entity in the foundations was stirring. Della could feel it, a subtle vibration in the stone floors, a deeper chill in the air. The shadows grew more agitated, clinging to Kalen like nervous animals. He grew more tense, the lines around his eyes deepening. They had nearly reconstructed the entire ritual. Only the final sequence of binding words remained elusive, scattered across a dozen half-burned fragments. The pressure was immense. Della worked tirelessly, pushing past exhaustion, her mind a whirlwind of words and symbols. She felt a fierce, protective urge to finish, to lift this burden from his shoulders, even for another 100 years. Meanwhile, far away in the sunlit lands, Lord Malvern's humiliation had curdled into a venomous obsession. He could not abide the thought of his scullery maid being elevated, of Lord Kalen choosing her over them all. He met in secret with the other 6 lords, their shared resentment a poison they fed to one another. "He has a weakness," Malvern insisted, pacing in his study. "That girl. He protects her. He values her. If we take her, we take his power. We can force him to concede the northern territories." They were fools, blinded by greed and arrogance. They mistook his interest for amorous infatuation, his protection for a vulnerability they could exploit. They pooled their resources and hired a man known only as the Silencer, a mercenary and assassin who specialized in infiltrating impossible places, a man who knew the old ways and the old fears. The Silencer came on the night of a storm, a raging tempest of wind and rain that threw itself against the stone walls of Kalen's fortress. He scaled the sheer cliffs under the cover of the gale, a ghost in the roaring dark, finding purchase where there was none. He slipped through an unguarded sluice gate, a forgotten entry point deep in the foundations. Inside the keep, Kalen felt the intrusion instantly. It was a dissonant note in the ancient song of his home. He was in the library with Della, the final fragments laid out before them. He went utterly still, his head lifting, his crimson eyes narrowing. "What is it?" Della asked, seeing the change in him. "We are no longer alone," he said, his voice a low growl. The shadows in the room recoiled, flowing towards him, merging with his form until he seemed to be made of living darkness. "Stay here. Do not leave this room." He moved, and he was simply gone. Not fast. He was there one moment, and the next, only empty air remained, the scent of ozone and cold stone lingering behind. Della's heart hammered in her chest. She stood alone in the vast library, the storm raging outside, an unknown threat now inside the walls. Her first instinct was to hide, to cower behind a bookshelf as she had been taught to do her entire life. But she was not that person anymore. The Silencer was good. He moved through the halls like a wraith, silent and unseen. He had been given a simple task: find the girl, take her, and leave a trail that pointed back to a rival clan, masking the Lord's involvement. He found the library, the only room brightly lit in the sleeping keep. He slipped inside, a shadow among shadows. He saw her, standing by the great table, her face pale in the lamplight. So this was the creature that had bewitched the shadow of the north. She looked like nothing special. He moved. Della heard a whisper of displaced air behind her. She spun around just as a hand clamped over her mouth, a muscular arm locking around her waist, lifting her from her feet. A cold blade pressed against her throat. "Scream and you die," a rough voice hissed in her ear. Terror, cold and absolute, seized her. But then feelings to meet it. Rage. A fierce, burning anger that someone would dare invade this place, that they would threaten this vital work, that they would try to use her to hurt Kalen. Before the Silencer could drag her away, the library doors slammed shut with a boom that shook the stone floors. The torches in the wall sconces flared with an unnatural green light. The temperature dropped so fast her breath plumed in the air. Kalen stood in the doorway. He was no longer the patient scholar or the melancholic lord. This was the vampire king, the ancient predator of the north. His crimson eyes were blazing infernos of fury. The shadows of the room poured towards him, writhing around his legs like a pack of loyal hounds. "Release her," he commanded, his voice not human. It was the sound of grinding rock, of an avalanche in the high peaks. The Silencer, for all his skill, was still a mortal man. He felt a fear so profound it threatened to stop his heart. But he held the knife steady against Della's skin. One more step, and she dies. I am not the one you want. My masters are far away. Let me leave with her, and you might see her again. Della felt the sting of the blade, a thin line of warmth. She refused to be a pawn. She refused to be his weakness. Her eyes scanned the table beside her, landing on a heavy iron letter opener, shaped like a miniature sword. While the two men were locked in their standoff, she acted. She stomped her heel down hard on the silencer's instep. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. She wrenched her head to the side and sank her teeth into the hand covering her mouth. He yelled, instinctively pulling his hand back. In that instant, she broke free, stumbling forward, grabbing the iron letter opener from the table. She spun around, not to run, but to face him, holding the makeshift weapon in front of her in a trembling, two-handed grip. The silencer, enraged, lunged for her. He never reached her. Kalen moved. He crossed the vast library in less than a heartbeat, a blur of black motion that the human eye could not follow. He was on the assassin in an instant, his hand closing around the man's throat, lifting him effortlessly into the air. The knife clattered to the floor. The silencer choked, his legs kicking uselessly. Kalen's face was a mask of cold, merciless rage. The shadows swirled around them, hungry and violent. He was going to kill him. "No!" Della cried out, her voice ringing in the sudden silence. Kalen froze, his burning eyes turning to hers. "Don't kill him," she said, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the iron letter opener still held before her. "He is a coward, but he is a message. We need to know who sent him." She looked at Kalen, her eyes pleading, but her stance was firm. "I am not your weakness," she stated, her voice shaking but resolute. "I stand with you, not behind you." Kalen stared at her for a long, silent moment. The inferno in his eyes slowly banked, replaced by that same stunned look of awe he'd had in Lord Malvern's hall. He saw her not as a victim to be saved, but as a partner who stood beside him, armed and defiant. He gave a slow nod. Then he turned his attention back to the gasping assassin, and his lips curled into a smile that held no warmth, only the promise of unending pain. "No," he agreed, his voice a silken threat. "Death would be a mercy. We have much to discuss." The winter solstice arrived under a sky of bruised purple clouds and the threat of snow. The ritual was complete. Under Kalen's persuasion, the silencer had confessed everything, naming Lord Malvern and the 6 other lords as his employers. Kalen performed the binding rite in the heart of the keep, in a chamber of bare, ancient stone. Della stood with him, her clear voice reciting the incantations from memory as he drew the symbols of containment with salt and powdered silver. As the final word was spoken, a deep, resonant hum vibrated through the fortress, a feeling of immense pressure being released, of a lock clicking firmly into place. The oppressive weight Della had felt since her arrival lifted. The keep was secure for another century, but their work was not done. 2 weeks later, a summons went out, bearing Kalen's intimidating seal. Every noble house in the region was commanded to attend a winter council at Blackwood Manor, Lord Malvern's estate. Attendance was not optional. The great hall was crowded and tense. Lord Malvern and his 6 co-conspirators sat at the high table, trying to appear confident, but their pallor betrayed them. They had no idea what was coming. Kalen entered last, but he did not enter alone. Della was at his side, not walking behind him, but beside him, her hand resting in the crook of his arm. She was no longer dressed in servant's gray, but in a gown of deep crimson velvet that Kalen had commissioned for her. It matched his eyes. Her hair was elegantly styled, and on her hand she wore a simple silver ring he had given her. She looked every inch a lady. Whispers erupted through the hall as they walked to the head of the table, Lord Malvern's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Caelan did not take a seat. He stood before the assembled nobility, Della beside him, and he began to speak. His voice was calm, but it held an edge of cold steel that commanded absolute silence. He told them of the ancient threat bound beneath his fortress, the duty his bloodline had carried for centuries to protect all their lands from it. He told them of the destroyed ritual and the desperate search for a way to restore it. And then he looked at Della. The key was found in the most unlikely of places, he said, his voice resonating with pride. It was found in the mind of this woman, Della, whose intellect and courage saved us all. While you feasted and hunted, she labored to restore the right that ensures your children can sleep safely in their beds. He let that sink in. Then his eyes narrowed, and his gaze fell upon the 7 lords at the high table. "And how was this savior of our lands rewarded by some among you?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "With scorn, with laughter, and ultimately, with a coward's plot to abduct and harm her, to use her as a pawn in a pathetic grab for power." He gestured to the doors, which swung open to reveal the silencer, bound in chains and flanked by Caelan's guards. The man was a broken shell of his former self. He was dragged before the assembly, and he repeated his confession, his voice dull and lifeless, naming each of the 7 lords. A wave of gasps and horrified murmurs swept the room. Lord Malvern and the others sat frozen, their faces the color of ash. Their ruin was absolute, witnessed by every one of their peers. The very people who had once listened to their whispers against Della now stared at them with contempt. "Their lands are forfeit to the crown," Caelan declared, his authority unquestioned. "Their titles stripped. They will live out their days in exile, remembered only for their treachery and their foolishness." He then turned back to Della, taking her hand. In front of the entire assembly, in front of the men who had called her filth, he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. "But this is not a story of punishment," he said, his eyes finding hers. "It is a story of honor." He produced a heavy, ornate ring from his pocket, a signet bearing the ancient crest of his house, a stylized raven on a field of stars. "I name Della of no house the chatelaine of my fortress, warden of its library, and keeper of its secrets. She is my partner, my equal, and her word is my word. Those who show her disrespect, show it to me." He slid the heavy ring onto her finger. It was cool and solid, a tangible weight of her new reality. The wound of her past, the unjust accusation, the years of invisibility. It was all gone, burned away in the fire of this public vindication. The men who had laughed at her were now forced to watch as she was elevated far beyond their reach. They had tried to make her small, and instead, they had made her a queen. A year passed. Della moved through the halls of the northern keep not as a guest or a ward, but as its mistress. The great stone fortress, once so intimidating, had become her home. The shadows were her quiet companions, bending to her will as they did to Caelan's, a silent testament to her place there. She had brought warmth and life to the ancient, lonely stones. Flowers bloomed in the protected courtyards, and the library was always filled with the scent of fresh ink and new pages. Her relationship with Caelan had settled into a deep and profound intimacy. It was a love built not on grand pronouncements, but on shared silence in the library, on the touch of his cool hand over hers on a book, on the stories he told her of ages past. and the hope for the future she gave him in return. He was the only person who had ever truly seen her, and in his gaze she had become the woman she was always meant to be. The second time the phrase was used, it was by her, in her own mind. He was her vampire king, her protector, and her partner. One evening, they sat by the fire in their shared chambers. The question of her mortality, the unspoken truth of their disparate natures, hung in the air between them, as it often did. She would age, she would wither, and he would remain. He took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her skin. "There is a way, you know," he said softly, his crimson eyes full of a love that was as deep and vast as time itself. "A choice you could make, to share my years." Della looked into his face, into the eyes that had seen empires rise and fall, and she felt no fear. She saw only her home. "And if I choose not to?" she asked gently. "Then I will love you for the length of your life," he said without hesitation. "I will cherish every moment I have with you, be it 50 years or 5. I will hold your hand until your last breath, and I will spend the next 1,000 years remembering you. The choice is yours, Della. Always." She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. His were cool, but the kiss was full of a warmth that came from the soul. She pulled back, resting her forehead against his. "A lifetime sounds like a beautiful start," she whispered.